Hi, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. And joining me today is Monica Hopkins. I'm so glad that she is going to be joining us to tell us what's going on with her work as the executive director of the ACLU of the District of Columbia. And she has worked on a lot of major efforts on criminal justice reform, LGBTQ plus equality, immigrants' rights, and First Amendment protections. And of course, she is at the center of the DC occupation, which we'll be talking about. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great. Well, it seems to me like I tend to say this a lot, like it's been a week, but it really has been one. It's been exhausting for everyone. I mean, we had Putin pushing Europe toward all-out war potentially with drones over Poland, and there's the Charlie Kirk assassination yesterday, the Epstein birthday book, and all of this amid the administration's takeover of Washington, D.C. and potentially taking over other cities like Chicago. But that issue seems to be kind of falling off our radar as there's so much chaos everywhere else. But I really would like to start there because, you're there in Washington. I'd really love if you could share with us really what it's like to be there, on the ground with National Guard troops, and others patrolling every day.
Yeah, so I just want to say it does feel incredibly chaotic.
Yeah.
And you pointed out, around the world, but also sort of here in the United States. And it seems to be just coming at us fast and furious.
Yeah.
Yeah, so acknowledging that, I want to say as a district resident, it's important to really talk about the truth on the ground prior to actually having the military and federal law enforcement sort of patrolling with our local law enforcement. And I think, as with any sort of city, state across the country, we have crime.
Sure.
Now, but as a district resident, I walk to restaurants, I walk my dog, I go out,
Right.
go to sporting events on a regular basis.
Right.
So really, fundamentally, let's talk about this was a manufactured emergency about crime by
Hmm.
the Trump administration. So that's a really fundamental piece of this.
Absolutely. Right.
And
I mean, and it seems like that basic premise has gotten lost a lot in the coverage. It's just kind of this assumption like, well, the president says the crime is up and that's why he's there. And, meanwhile, we've kind of skipped a lot of steps. And, I'm a longtime journalist, and it's kind of weird to see that because, um, it's our job to question the premise, to question our elected officials. And I'm seeing less and less of that lately, which is a disturbing trend. But as someone who is a native Chicagoan and I live in Michigan now, I've heard, Chicago's been long targeted as, it's just a cesspool. Detroit had that reputation for
Mhm.
years and years and has struggled to shed that, stereotype. But, in reality, in most of our major cities like Washington, like Chicago, violent crime has been declining. And frankly, the rates in a lot of smaller cities and red states is far higher.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at is, local officials and communities who are closer to the problem are the best to deal with issues of crime,
Mhm.
and the surrounding issues. What we're talking about is public safety. And so,
Right.
we have proven approaches to these issues that are best dealt with local officials. And we know that across the country. So in DC, this manufactured, emergency that must be dealt with allowed the Trump administration to call in the National Guard because we do not have statehood. So the president, you know, oversees the National Guard, which he reminded us of, during January 6th. He said he didn't have control of the National
Right.
Guard.
Yeah.
So in this case, he does. He does with our limited home rule. And what we are seeing on the ground, again, as a DC resident, I'm a fan of women's soccer, and go to a soccer game and think about just going to, an event in a city. And I went to the soccer game and I came out and there were National Guard members holding, semi-automatic guns, right? That is not something that we want in our city. The Washington Post said 80% of DC residents do not want this.
Mhm.
And it is a tactic to instill fear and intimidation, not really to address issues of public safety.
Right. I happened to be in Washington a couple weeks ago with my family, and we just flashed a photo, one of the photos that I took. This is right outside the National Gallery, which is, I'm sure is such a high crime area. You really need these heavily armed troops there. And, they were there at the Lincoln Memorial too, because we did all the touristy stuff with our kids.
Yeah.
And this was the scene. They were just standing around everywhere, whether it was metro stations or these major landmarks. I didn't even see anyone picking up trash. I know there have been stories about that. But it's uncomfortable,
Yeah.
to walk down the street, and this is just me as a tourist, not as a resident, which I'm sure is far more disturbing. But, when you make the decision that you want to, go out to eat, after work, or, if you're taking your family on vacation, as Americans, we're not used to seeing people with machine guns, troops out there patrolling the streets. That's something that, we're used to seeing in faraway places in the Middle East, war-torn regions. And, I I know obviously your role as the head of the major civil liberties organization in the country. We definitely want to talk about the massive implications in terms of our rights, our
Mhm.
freedoms, where we're going in the direction of our country. But just for us as everyday citizens, I don't think this is a comfortable situation. I don't think this is something that very many people want to get used to.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, right? Like, uh, this moment cannot be divorced from the effect. It is DC. It happened in DC, and the president, in his press conference, made it very clear that it wasn't just about DC,
Right.
right? So he said it will be the first place and then we'll roll it out. And you just said something that's really important, which is it is not normal, right? But the more you see, National Guard out there or federal law enforcement, uh, it is an attempt to normalize it.
Yes.
And we have to be very clear. Yes, we are the ACLU. There are issues with calling in the military
Mhm.
and calling in federal law enforcement to act in roles that they are not meant to do
Right.
on the local streets, in cities, in this country. And so that's really important to remember. And I just want to say, you said as a visitor to DC, it was very uncomfortable. And we're seeing that on the ground, right? Like people are asking, is it safe to go to DC, or having the experience that you had and being like, I don't know that I want to go back there.
Right.
And we are a city that is a high tourist city, and we're seeing the economic impact
Yeah.
already on the city.
Yeah. And now, going into next year, which is an election year, I think it's hard to talk about this issue without kind of that looming issue of, are we going to see troops at polling stations? Is that a ramp up for that? And, that certainly seems to be part of this, where Trump is going with this. And then with the budget that Congress passed that supersizes ICE, to the tune of $175 billion, that's even more manpower that can be on our streets. At this point next year, we could be looking at massive incursions in most blue cities across the country. And, um, you know, as Americans, we really cherish the idea of freedom and being able to do what we want. And obviously, there are limits to that. But I think something that very few of us really think about is that, yes, I would like to go to the grocery store without seeing the National Guard there with machine guns. That is not something that makes me feel like I'm part of the land of the free and the home of the brave. And so I know that people in DC have made it very clear in all the polling that they don't like this. I can't imagine that this is something that will be widely popular anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing that in, Chicago. There has been an influx of ICE in Chicago, and the pushback that DC obviously does not have the ability to do from their governor, from their mayor.
Mhm.
But Chicago residents are making it very clear that they do not want this. And I think people across the country, regardless of political ideology or spectrum, are really honing in on, this is not who we are
Mhm.
as a democracy. This is not normal, and this is not the way to deal with these issues.
Yeah.
You had said, earlier, you're a journalist, and sort of sitting back and really taking a pause, right? Like things are coming so fast and so furious. It's sort of like flooding the zone.
Right.
And how important it is to take a pause and ask ourselves, what is going on here?
Mhm.
What is really going on?
Mhm.
And it would have been, a few years ago, if we had sat here talking and said, well, the president would call out the military in American cities and increase the budget of those military forces and federal law enforcement to deploy them in this way. Or, we would see outside of Union Station armed, military that parents, and this is the Washington Post reported on this, parents in DC have created walking school buses to, bring their kids to school and make sure they get safely.
Yeah.
It would have been people would have thought we were
Right.
conspiracy theorists or
Right. Right.
hyperbolic. So I do think that the one thing we can all agree upon is that, we have a democracy here, and we should be able to agree that this isn't normal, it is not right, and we need to stand up against it.
Yeah. And certainly thousands of people in DC did stand up last weekend, and I was really heartened to see those protests. I kind of had to search a little bit for some of the coverage. I mean, there was some excellent coverage, but certainly not on the scale that I would have expected, especially because still so much of the media is centered in DC. It's pretty easy to cover something like this. It definitely seemed like it was a bigger event than people expected. And I know that we showed an image that was so striking, and the occupation in front of the Capitol, next to a Palestinian flag. And you really have to ask, like, which occupation are we talking about? The one in the U.S., the one in Gaza, both. What what an extraordinary juxtaposition for us to be in right now to see that. Were you in DC during that time? Did you happen to see any of the protesters or know
Yeah.
anyone who went? Okay.
I mean, Free DC, who organized sort of organized is getting folks together. There were a huge list of organizations. There were civic organizations. There were community members who coalesced around this. I think that the photo that I saw, for anyone who's familiar with DC, was just the sea of people
Yeah.
coming down 16th Street, just really filling the streets. And being in DC that day really gave a strong visual to the uprising against this
Mhm.
type of overreach and, yes, occupation, and the resistance to turning over our democracy, which, DC residents uh, for a long, long, long time have experienced this government overreach and interference, and really a disconnection from what we say we have, which is a representative democracy, because we don't have statehood.
Yes.
And it is not surprising to me that that many people took to the streets in this way, given what's going on.
Right. Um, it seems that you were talking about the fact that if we had talked about this before the election, that this was a possibility, we would all sound nuts, and now here we are. But I mean, this to me seems like a really clear example of this creeping authoritarianism. I mean, it's not normal. We've seen various policies for presence over the years that certainly a lot of us have taken issue with. There have been many anti-war movements, people railing for civil rights, but the idea that we are now having the federal government occupy cities with armed troops, that's a place that we have not been in a very long time, and certainly harkens back to some of the most divisive periods in American history, obviously, with the Civil War, and then with trying to enforce civil rights laws down south, where it's a very different situation, where you had the federal government say you have to comply, and you had people who were clinging on to Jim Crow laws and fighting against it. Um, so at this point, do you feel like where do you feel our debate is at on this? Do you feel like there has been enough attention on the fact that, these are autocratic moves? These are, this is a step towards us losing basic rights and liberties. And how and how do we get the conversation there? Because I mean that's critical. Obviously, that's your life's work, but I mean that's for us as Americans. I mean that's really fundamental to our DNA.
Yeah, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this, not only because, I'm the executive director of the ACLU here in DC, but also, prior to that, I was the executive director of the ACLU in Idaho. So,
Very
um,
different.
very, very different.
Right.
you know, and, we've gotten so far away from, um, what we have established in our country as the institutions of democracy that really upheld our ability to have political discussions and disagreements. And, we've gotten away from sort of this instantaneous stimulus and response,
Mhm.
that, oh, we have an emergency, we have to deal with it in this way and come down with the full
Mm,
force of the state, right?
right.
And I think right now, it's sort of that slow burn that you're talking about, like over time, it's like, how did we get here?
Mhm.
And I think the critical question right now is sort of, I guess, hearkening back to Ben Franklin,
Mm.
like someone asked him, "What did you give us?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it."
Yes.
And the question is, can we keep it, right?
Right.
And how are we going to do that in this moment?
Yeah.
The ACLU, we are fighting in court. We also, have here in DC, we have our local DC council and AG and standing up for a limited self-governance here in DC, but also with Congress, and really sort of educating Congress, because Congress can intervene in DC
Right.
and our laws. And in this moment, again, should also be seen as sort of a tester balloon for what congressional members might want to implement in other places.
Yeah. Um, and so right now we're, sitting here sifting through the news of Charlie Kirk's murder. And I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about the rise of political violence. As we're at a point where, there's this effort to normalize, troops in our cities, and these big federal moves to have control over a lot of our basic rights and freedoms. And there's a move to take those away, whether it's trans rights or reproductive rights or rights for immigrants. It seems like we are in a really toxic place where these are not just simple political disagreements. This is a matter of people um, debating over who has the right to be an American, who has the right to exist. And with Charlie Kirk being murdered yesterday, that's not anywhere close to the first example that we have of political violence. I live in Michigan. Our
Mhm.
governor back in 2020 was the subject of an assassination plot. And by the way, the president has called it a hoax and has laughed about it. We had a few months ago the former speaker of the Minnesota House was killed along with her husband and dog right in her home, and was
Mhm.
being targeted for politics. And so, what kind of moment are we in? What can we do? Because certainly this is this is a dangerous moment where anyone can be killed for their views. Um, but at the same time, we do have a president that is, if anyone watched his speech last night, I mean, this was not a let's get together and heal speech. This was, we have enemies, we need to root them out. And you should all be on the side of whoever I deem to be your enemy. I know there's a lot here to sort through, but I just feel like you're a really good person to talk to about, what we can do right now and the moment that we're in.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I'll start in this place. First of all, the killing of Charlie Kirk is a tragedy. Like I think we pause and acknowledge
Mhm.
that just as Representative Hortman was a tragedy, and I think you're linking sort of this thread of political violence that we have seen. I don't think we can not mention also at the end of last year, Justice Roberts indicated that there was an increase in sort of violence, political threats, to the judiciary.
Right, right.
Um, and I think what we can do in this moment is really, I keep going back to this pause, but it was Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor, writer of the meaning, Man's Search for Meaning, who said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And
Mm.
in that space is our power to choose our response.
Mhm.
And right now, I mean, I don't know what you've seen already this morning, but this morning, this call to lay blame, point fingers, take action, will obscure what we should be calling for, which is adherence to our democracy,
Mhm.
that we will absolutely not tolerate political violence. It has no place in our democracy. It actually undermines our democracy, no matter who or what happens, and a recognition that this is going on.
Mhm.
And so we have to remember we are a representative democracy,
Right.
and people actually need to tell their representatives that this is not okay
Mhm.
across the board. We have to show up in the streets with the rise of sort of military in our streets. We have to
Mhm.
continue fighting in the courts. But I do think this recognition, and if we want to keep our representative democracy, if we really do value having the First Amendment, being able to have healthy civic debate
Mhm.
about these things, we have to pause in this moment and really understand that we have a fork in the road and we have a decision to make, and we
Mhm.
have the tools to make sure we make the right decision to keep our democracy. We just
Right.
have to use them.
Right. I mean, the concept of democracy, I view this as, this is the alternative to violence. This is how we live together in a society, even though we have different ideas and different backgrounds. Everyone, there's the old joke, that democracy isn't perfect, but it's, the best system that we have. And no, nobody has come up with anything better at this point.
Yeah.
But it is under threat. And, our right to peacefully protest, I mean, that's a
Mhm.
powerful tool, as an alternative to this idea of, trying to, forcefully subdue your enemies and take away their basic rights. I think, that is a tool that we still have. And of course, you fight every day for the rule of law. And,
Mhm.
through our legal system, I know the ACLU is at the forefront of so many court cases to protect, basic rights for LGBTQ people and trans people in particular who have been under assault, abortion rights, the many anti-immigrant policies of this administration. Um, and so can you update us a little bit about where those fights are in court and where you see things heading?
Yeah, I think, I'd be remiss not to mention the decision that came down uh, um, by the Supreme Court, uh, you know, on, on the situation going on in LA.
Right.
And it's very disturbing,
Right.
right? Like, and we will continue to fight.
Mhm.
The Supreme Court sort of ignored the decisions of the lower courts
Yes.
and went well beyond saying that, with ICE being in LA, that they could use certain indicators of race or perception of, immigration. So language, skin color, all of these things
Right.
that would justify sort
Yeah.
of the stops, the interactions, the
Yeah.
detainment. That is very, very troubling.
Yeah.
We are still in a place where, we have the rule of law, but it is, and we will continue fighting, but does give us, again, here I am with the pause, right?
Right. And it really does harken back to, again, some of these really dark periods of American history. I
Mhm.
mean, the Japanese internment camps during
Yeah.
World War II, in California. And actually, one of the first things I did when Trump was elected the first time was visiting one of them, which was a pretty sobering experience. But, you know, those were lessons that you always think are learned, but they can history is um there's the old phrase, it's written by the winners, and right now
Yeah.
it it's being rewritten in a way that is, in my mind, making some of those very dangerous mistakes that we had in the past, and even beyond the really dangerous racial racist policy, which I don't mean to undermine. Just in general, the Supreme Court's position to this administration, um, we have not seen a court give the executive this much power
Yeah.
in decades. Um, which really alters, the way we function as a country. I mean, we're actually well beyond this concept of the unitary executive, to the point of it's fine for someone to take on extra legal, what used to be considered extra legal powers.
Yeah.
So that's not a check on his power anymore. But as you made the point, the lower courts have been trying to rein
Mhm.
in the Trump administration. I know you and many other organizations have scored a lot of important victories there. But what do you do when that can be negated so quickly by 9 justices at the Supreme Court?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember a lot of times we think, oh, the Supreme Court is the court and the final arbiter
Mhm.
of decisions. And in one way, it is when things get up to the Supreme
Right.
Court,
But
right?
they don't take the vast majority of
Yeah,
cases.
right. They take a very, thin slice
Mhm,
of, versus the thousands of courts that we have, at various levels in
mhm.
this country. And so, when people are like, well, we don't have the Supreme Court, and they seem that all hope is lost. It is
Right.
not. We actually have a robust judiciary. There are wins. There are wins that are staying in place.
Mhm.
Um, but I think you mentioned something that is really important is this expansion of sort of executive power. And, when we look at the beginning of the expansion of executive power, it was actually Lincoln who, the Civil War, like, declared civil war, went into civil war without the purse of Congress, right?
Suspended
And
habeas corpus.
Right. So, and it was justified, right? And I
Mhm.
think remembering those points in our history, remembering our history, because I think history is written by the winners, but also we have a little bit of historical amnesia.
Yeah.
The Alien Enemies Act that was used for those internment camps.
That
Um,
is now being invoked again.
Right, right. And so I think presidents have always pushed the bounds of this,
Mhm.
executive authority.
Right.
And now we're seeing it in new ways. And the question is, will Congress, particularly in this moment,
In this moment.
the the 30 days is up, for the emergency here in DC, but will Congress allow him to continue these emergencies?
These emergencies. Right. And, something that I think has gotten lost as, we're in such a hyper partisan time is, over the years, the ACLU, has taken every administration to court, Obama, Bush one, Bush two. I mean, because for various reasons. I mean, um, I know post 9/11 with the huge
Mhm.
expansion with the Department of Homeland Security and FISA, obviously, that taking on the G, uh, GW Bush administration. I think I would hope maybe some people remember those days, but many of those policies were continued under Democratic President Barack Obama. And,
Right.
it's not like your organization said, oh, well, now it's fine, because it's the principle of what you're fighting for and for civil liberties. But it does seem to me that we've gotten to a point where we've moved away from this idea that the work that you do and the fight for civil liberties is more of a bipartisan fight. That
Mm.
unites elements of the left and right. I mean, obviously, we had back in the 1988 election where George H.W. Bush attacked Michael Dukakis as the card carrying member of the ACLU. His
Right.
or you're a Massachusetts liberal and out of touch.
That
Um,
showed up in the movie The American President.
right, right.
Right.
So this is not a new fight, but we still do have, members of the Republican Party that, like former Congressman Justin Amash from Michigan, that,
Mm.
often would be one of your strongest allies on,
Yeah.
um, this massive incursion to our private data and, drone warfare and
Yeah.
things like that. Do you see us being able to get to a point where, we can kind of rebuild some of these important alliances? Because I mean, the fight for civil liberties is so crucial to who we are as a country, and it really shouldn't be a partisan issue.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't a partisan issue. It is a nonpartisan issue to believe in democracy.
Mhm.
We are the youngest democracy. We will celebrate 250 years next year. We are also the longest running democracy. And from my time in Idaho and like you mentioned in other states where Republicans have come forward, what we are agreeing upon is certain principles, right? Like there should be checks on the government. There should be due process. There should be the ability to speak out, to redress your government. We should have a free press. All of these ideas that are baked into our Constitution, our Bill of Rights to ensure that our democracy stays intact. And that is sort of, I call it like the Venn diagram. If we can agree upon those principles, we may have different reasons for coming to the issue. We may
Right.
have different ideas about what should be done about different things, but we have to agree on certain specific things
Mhm.
that we actually enshrined in our Constitution and Bill of Rights. And so I think this is the moment. And I think my role here at the ACLU, I think the ACLU is a great Venn diagram maker in that way, because we have such a core set of principles that we work from.
Right. right. Um, yeah, I know that you've been involved in so many fights over the years, and this seems to be, we're really at a fundamental point right now about what kind of country we're going to be, what we really believe in, what rights are afforded to us and to who. And so the work that you do at the ACLU is such a crucial part of that. And I appreciate that you've taken some time to talk with us today about your work. I know that you will be involved in so many of the fights to come, and so I hope that you'll be able to come back and update us on the state of things. And I appreciate your perspective that all is not lost. There are things that we can do to fight back, because all of us have those days where we feel like we can't. And so it's great to talk with you, because you're in this fight, and at the highest levels. And so if you can have hope, I feel like we all can.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I really appreciate these conversations. I think uh, as Americans in this country, as people in this country, we should be having more of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Monica.
Yeah.